Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined again by our fantastic guest, David Howman. Listeners, David is chair of the board of directors at the Athletics Integrity Unit for World Athletics, and he first joined us on the show in episode 4, so you can check out our previous interview for more background information. But today, we are really going to focus on talking about the Athletics Integrity Unit in more detail. So, David, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Oh, very good. Thanks, Marie.
Well, I'm so excited to have you here with us today, and I'm looking forward to learning more about Athletics Integrity Unit. But to get all of our listeners on the same page first, can you start by telling everyone more about yourself and your role there?
Well, it's always difficult to talk about yourself, isn't it? But essentially, I grew up as a lawyer. I practiced a lot of sport law when I was a barrister here in New Zealand. That led to being the lawyer for the New Zealand Sports Drug Agency. I then became its chair, and more or less as a consequence of all that, became an initial board member of the World Anti-Doping Agency. That was in 1999. And I was appointed as the chair of their legal commission. So that led to the drafting of the first World Anti-Doping Code and so on. But to cut a long story short, Richard Pound asked me to come and join the management team in Montreal for a short contract. And of course, I asked my wife and she said it was okay to go. We'll treat it as a sabbatical. Well, I went as a general counsel and chief operating officer. That morphed into being the director general after 6 months or so. And we ended up being in Montreal for close to 14 years.
Oh, wow. More than a short trip.
It wasn't, no. And I tell people it was 14 winters because, of course, the winters up North America are pretty cold compared to what they're like down here. But what happened afterwards was then I was looking for things to do, and I was approached by the IAAF to consider applying to be the chair of their new body called the Athletics Integrity Unit. And the IAAF had established that in response really to the challenges to their reputation as a result of the reports that were written on Russia by WADA, and one specific one which directed itself toward what was going on inside the IAAF. And listeners will know that the president of the IAAF was in fact arrested and subsequently convicted of fraud and corruption. So Seb Coe, the new leader, did a constitutional review. And he decided that World Athletics needed an independent body looking after reputational issues in the area of sport integrity. So that came into being in early 2017, and I was appointed the first chair.
Oh, fantastic. So I know for the PCC, anti-doping is really the major focus, but Athletics Integrity Unit actually deals with a wide range of integrity issues in sport. So David, can you give our listeners a sense of just the scope of the different types of concerns you actually deal with there?
Yes, I can, Marie. I mean, it's a really broad mandate. It's almost anything that attacks the reputation of the sport in terms of bad behaviour or cheating. And so we have a mandate to look after the anti-doping program. We explore issues relating to what we call event manipulation or competition manipulation, those who try to rig results either to qualify for events or to establish records and so on. We look at corruption. We look at harassment and abuse. We have age manipulation as one of the issues we deal with. There have been a lot of occasions that we have found of recent times where competitors have falsified their date of birth so that they can represent their countries in junior events and so on. So it's, as I said, I think anything that brings the sport into disrepute falls within our mandate, and it's our job to look at that behaviour and determine whether sanction processes should follow.
Absolutely. And in talking about your own background, you spoke a little bit about the history, but can you explain a little bit more in detail, what is the relationship between Athletics Integrity Unit and World Athletics, which is now formally known as the IAAF?
Well, we are part of World Athletics, and we exist as a result of their constitutional changes, but we are operationally fully independent of them. In other words, there's no interference in what we do from anyone in World Athletics. I have nothing to do with the sport. I've never been part of that particular sport. I've got board members who are in a similar position to me in relation to that. We are funded by World Athletics. So we get $8 million a year by World Athletics to deal with the issues that come within our remit. Beyond that, we have to report to them about the use of that money and, of course, on how our programs are being developed. But as I said, we're not told what to do. We are asked to report so that members can understand our task. We also now receive $4 million a year or thereabouts from the road racing circuit, and that includes world marathons, because they needed help in the area mostly of anti-doping. And so we do that work for them. which they pay for. So we've got extra money, but an extra task to do from what we started with. And of course, Marie, the board's role in all this is to really oversee what the management team does. And one of the first tasks we had in 2017 was to appoint a head of the unit, commonly really referred to around the world as a CEO, I guess. And that process threw up quite a lot of really good applicants. We chose to be our first head, Brett Clothier from Australia, and he's still in position. He runs a very fine ship in the management team.
Oh, that's wonderful. And you mentioned that the organization was established back in 2017, and I imagine it sort of changed and evolved over the years. So what are some of the key ways that Athletics Integrity Unit has actually grown or changed since it was first established, since you've sort of been there since the beginning?
Well, you're quite right to say that. I mean, the first task we had when we started was really dealing with all the fallout from the exposure in Russia and what the Russian Athletics Federation had been up to, but more what their athletes had been doing in terms of doping. And it would be fair to say, I think we've still got a couple of those cases that we're dealing with as a result of all the information that WADA got from the computers out of the Moscow laboratory. So that has been a big task for us from the outset. We, alongside that, helped the team, the other independent team that was established by World Athletics to look at the Russian Athletics Federation. And some of the information that they got in their reports came from us. And as one little example, there was a Russian athlete who said, or gave us a reason for not being at the place that he ought to have been for a doping test. We got eventually a lot of stuff in writing from the athlete, corroborated by the Russian Athletics Federation president and secretary general. And it was a lie, basically. So it used an address. He said this man was at a hospital receiving treatment at the time. That was investigated. We found that the hospital address that he had mentioned was, in fact, a construction site inside Moscow.
Oh, wow.
So that sort of thing has had to be looked at sort of in addition to the normal anti-doping program. And that led to both the president of the federation and the director general and another couple of board members also being sanctioned. So you can see that it wasn't an easy ride. And what we have done subsequently is try to make sure that we look at the rest of the mandate in a sensible and pragmatic way. We obviously have jurisdiction over international athletes and international members of national federations and so on who hold key positions. They come under the World Athletics Constitution. We're now looking at which of the areas we should be prioritising to ensure that people know they've got to stop doing the things that they might be doing. So that includes event manipulation. We had 17 cases of athletes qualifying to go to the Tokyo Olympic Games where they had falsified the qualification times or lengths or events or whatever. So we had to look at those, and we've done that, and we've looked at ways and means of ensuring that won't happen again. We're looking at, as I said at the outset, age manipulation, several examples of athletes going to World Junior Championships when they weren't juniors. So we've looked at that. We show no fear of who we address in these situations. If it's the president of a federation, that person must be sanctioned in the same way as an athlete. So, for example, we have just sanctioned the president of Albanian Athletes Federation and one of his offsiders, both of whom were responsible for falsifying a qualification event for one of their athletes going to Tokyo. Now, of course, those people went to Tokyo, preventing someone else from going. And our attitude and our approach to these things from a policy point of view, we must support the athletes who are playing the game in the correct fashion, including no cheating of any sort. And so we're looking at that area and how we can ensure that it doesn't happen again. That's quite a long answer, and I could go on for a long time, Marie, but I think that sort of gives you a bit of an idea of where we're heading.
Absolutely. And I have to ask, is it maybe disheartening for you or frustrating for you? You're working so close to all of these cases where things are happening that, like you said, are challenging the integrity of sport or are just downright unfair for athletes who may have suffered the consequence as a result of, for example, someone taking what would have been their spot going to an Olympics.
And that's when everybody knows it's unfair. Those who are cheating know it's unfair to their fellow competitors. And so we've got to stop that behaviour. And I suppose that then goes into some of the areas that we might discuss later, education and so forth. But what I can tell you, we started with a team of 5. Now we have 35. 35 in an office is not a big number. We have, I think at last count, 12 or 13 investigators who do the work in the areas that we've discussed already today. So That is a big chunk of the work we do. I think we're probably the only sporting organisation that has that percentage of people doing that sort of work. And that has led to some of the issues being found out. And we will continue to build that in a sensible fashion.
Absolutely. Well, it was a perfect segue. Perhaps let's talk about education next. How does Athletics Integrity Unit approach education, and what resources do you provide?
Well, how long is a piece of string, Marie? What we do is provide our education materials for those within our remit. So we've got an international pool of athletes in the registered testing pool. We must make sure that all of those athletes know the rules, they know the processes. But what we have done is gone beyond that over the last couple of years and looked at a behavioural science approach to it. And we've engaged with Leeds Beckett University in the UK to help us do this. They have run focus groups looking at not just athletes, but the whole entourage, coaches and trainers and doctors and so on, to see what the challenges to sport integrity are at the moment and create the context in which they occur so that we can address them better. So the program that we have now been running, and we've done this a little bit over the last couple of years, and as a result of the pandemic, of course, we've done a lot of stuff online. It includes the engagement of an education program that is delivered in 10 languages to get to athletes and athlete support people across the world. We have what we call area federations. Other sports call them confederations. We've got 6 areas which have to be looked at, and we provide information to all of them. What we are doing at all of these moments during this program is doing deep dives to see that it is actually getting somewhere. Some of these things take time. And of course, you've got to have patience and you've got to have strength and endurance to be able to go further than just here are the rules. We're finding that this is now having some considerable impact, not just with athletes, but for those who advise them. And I think that's a really important part of any education program. You've got to make sure everybody comes with you, because if the trainers and the coaches are on a different page, what you tell their athletes is not worth much. If your parents aren't behind you and know what's going on, also not worth much. The final part of this jigsaw really of education is to ensure the public knows. And so that's one of the next steps that we've got to look at and how we can do things for the public.
Absolutely. And I know, as we had mentioned, the organization was founded in 2017, so only about 6 years there under your belt. So how do you start to evaluate the impacts of programs such as your education program?
You've got to rely on those who are learning from it to give you feedback. And the way we're running it is to constantly get feedback so that it's not something you wait till the end of the year on. You're doing it as you're going. And partnering with an academic university like Leeds Beckett has helped us in that regard, because they've got people who can do the research and do it better than we can. So we do that. The board oversees it as well. So I can tell you that the board is really keen on this area and really keen that it has an impact, so much so that they were pretty critical about some of the things at times. So we are doing what we can with an aggressive approach, one that centres on what hits the ground. In other words, we need to know that what we're doing has an impact on the athletes and the athlete entourage.
Absolutely. And I know in addition to your hard work on the education program, you also have a strong anti-doping testing program and a TUE program as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about these elements?
As I said, we started with an anti-doping program that we concentrated on because we wanted it to be the best in the world. And we wanted to, therefore, improve the reputation that World Athletics had or didn't have. So we base our testing program on quality. We're not interested in numbers. We're not interested in quantity. You and I could go down the street and test people and say, we've done 100 tests today. We're not about that. We're about making sure that each test counts to the day, the hour, in fact, sometimes to the minute in terms of when these samples are collected. Every person in our registered testing pool has an individual profile program. So we ensure that they're tested at the right time and we ensure that is consistent. So based then on what I've called quality, I would say excellence even, we run a pretty good testing program. I've been around for a while now. I can tell you it's probably one of the best that's operating in the world at present. No tests are random, and that's a really important statement to make. We don't do random testing. When it comes to TUEs, we have a TUE approach. It's set out pretty clearly on our website. Just to give you an example, so we don't give them out willy-nilly. We are an organisation that looks at these things very carefully. And for example, last year, Marie, we had 34 applications for TUEs. Only 15 were granted. We know that there are times when athletes are trying to get an edge by the medication they take, and that's not really to cover any illness that they've had. So we are really careful in that area.
Absolutely. Well, that's really good to hear. I know monitoring these TUEs, therapeutic use exemptions, is important for, like you said, ensuring that people aren't trying to take advantage of the system to their benefit in an unfair way. And I know transparency is another key tenet of the organization. And it's really important for athletes to know what the process is and what will happen if they're involved in any sort of integrity issue. So what is Athletic Integrity Unit's process for investigations and, if appropriate, disciplinary action for cases?
Let me start with it. We think it's really important that other athletes know who is cheating. So we have a policy, for example, in relation to those who are provisionally suspended to publish that. And we publish it on our website. So you can go to the website and see a list of those who are provisionally suspended. They move to another list, which is also transparent, and we're one of the few sports that does this, showing every athlete that has been sanctioned. In fact, since our outset in 2017. But not only do we publish the names and the length of the sanction and the reason for it, we also publish the decisions. So anybody wanting to find out why a decision was taken or why a sanction was so long can go in on the website, get the decision, read it, be happy or unhappy, it doesn't worry me, but it's certainly transparent and shows everybody what we're doing. We believe that is what we should be doing, because not only do people need to know what we're doing, but they also need to know why we've done it and why the sanctions have been imposed. Mm-hmm. So that's something different from most other anti-doping organisations. We have a firm belief that it is helpful and certainly helpful for clean athletes. But when it comes to the other matters you mentioned, I think you talked about investigation. So I said before, we've got a very big investigations team. We've got specialists within that team. We've got people who are looking at issues of age manipulation. That's not the whole team. We have people who are looking at what's going on in the anti-doping world to see whether people are trying to hoodwink us by saying that they're in some place and they're somewhere else. You can have 3 strikes in a year about your whereabouts information. So some athletes, we suggest, might try to get away with 2 and don't get the 3rd because the next 12-month segment comes up. We don't think that's a good thing. So we want to look at why people are not where they said they would be. And sometimes that's unearthed other issues that has allowed us to follow the athlete and test them and perhaps even get a positive case. So we do all that. I think in terms of the disciplinary action, we do it totally according to the rules. There are lots and lots of discussions with athletes and their advisors as to whether there needs to be a hearing or whether there can be a reduced sanction because they help us with information and so on, and we do all of that. I don't know the numbers, but I know in the last 2 years, following a change in the World Anti-Doping Code, there are far fewer cases that go to hearing and more cases where people will accept a sanction lessened because they've accepted it. So I think that's actually showing quite a good process and the fact that athletes acknowledge that process.
Certainly, and I know this issue of transparency can be a little bit of a touchy subject, and people may have differing opinions in terms of the timing or maybe the extent of the disclosure. Was it difficult to get everybody on board with this kind of full transparency approach that you take?
Look, sometimes you have discussions and you don't do something because you are only 99% sure it is possible. And there will be some advisors, particularly those who are trained in the law, who don't want you to take that 1% risk. We don't see that as a 1% risk. We see it as a 99% approach, and that the 99% warrant what we're doing. And I think that just shows we possibly are not as conservative as some others. I'm not criticising people for doing it in a different fashion. We haven't had any problem with it since we introduced it 4 years ago. So that sort of makes us feel comfortable in terms of how we've done it. But I certainly wouldn't be criticising other people if they haven't done it. I know you have to take advice, and sometimes you get advice which tells you can't do it. I was always an operator who wanted to get lawyers to tell you how you can do something, not why you can't do it. And I maintain that sort of approach as chair of this board.
Very interesting. And we've touched on just some of the things that really make Athletics Integrity Unit unique compared to other sport or anti-doping organizations, whether it's the large investigations team and some of these other factors. Are there any other that you'd like to bring to light for our listeners?
I think in terms of other anti-doping organisations, we probably have a pretty high percentage of successful cases because we do make sure that we look at athletes and conduct our testing program to catch those who are cheating. I don't think we've got any fear in the way we carry out. We don't fear retribution from anybody. We don't want to yell from the rooftops that we're really good. We want our work to speak for itself, and we want to continue to develop the reputation that the work does for us. I think probably what we have done is invested quite well, not in just hiring people, but getting the best people to do the best work. And we will continue to do that. You don't need a whole host of people for that. As I said, we've got 35 in our office, but the investment we make in them is to allow them to do the best possible job they can. And I think that's pretty significant from a board perspective and looking at what they're doing. It really makes me feel proud of everyone in the office.
Definitely. I think having these phenomenal team members and forming these key partnerships can go a long way. So can we talk a little bit more about the partnerships? How does Athletics Integrity Unit work with partner organizations, for example, like the PCC or perhaps WADA, NATOs, and other organizations to really help ensure clean sport?
Well, it's pretty easy with WADA and NATOs. We in the anti-doping area, of course, only, not the other integrity parts of what we do. But we try to get WADA to see the way we see things, and we try to help them to look at possible changes. We do that in a respectful fashion, I hope. We certainly work with NATOs because we need them to help us around the globe. And we have a rule in the World Athletics Constitution called Rule 15, where we as an organisation put the onus on the national federations to ensure their athletes are tested before they go to international events. So what we do is say to all the national federations, your athletes must be tested probably at least 3 times before the World Championships or before the Olympic Games. We've got a group which we call Category A where those countries haven't done that. And prior to Tokyo, because some of them hadn't done it, we had to tell them that some of their athletes couldn't go and compete in Tokyo. Now, that had a huge ripple effect because by the time we then came to last year, to 2022, the World Championships in Eugene, none of those, what we call Rule 15 Category A countries, were banned from the Games, none of their athletes. So it shows that they were able to go back to their NATO or their testing agency and make sure their athletes were tested before they competed internationally. That's a really good thing. We are doing a review of that rule and the way it's worked so that we look at whether countries are in the right categories. And that's a piece of work we'll be doing later this year and early next year to make sure that the Olympic Games in Paris is not one where athletes are stopped from going because they haven't been tested. But more importantly, that the other athletes who are tested can look around and say, I'm now comfortable because I know everybody in the start line is in the same position as me. We have all been tested, and the AIU has told us that. So that's a really good piece of work that we've done with national federations who then rely on the NATOs. If you look at the PCC, we have had a healthy relationship with the PCC since we started, and I have to commend those in that office for involving us. I looked around the room the other day in New York and there weren't many other international federations present. We actually admire the work the PCC is doing. We've got a healthy relationship with the major leagues that are part of the PCC. We want that to continue, and we would like to develop the way in which we could do more by way of collaboration as we go forward. So I'm sure Ryan and his team will do that, and I'm sure we'll look forward to how we can do more with them, because we are working in the same area, and it makes no sense not to work with people, even if they don't come under the World Anti-Doping Code like other sports. So we think this is something for the future.
Definitely. And I know the PCC was so glad to have you at this year's conference. So in terms of talking about collaboration, we mentioned the Athletics Integrity Unit has not yet been part of the PCC's research collaborative. Do you have thoughts, at least at this point, David? I know discussions are ongoing, but about how the PCC and Athletics Integrity Unit might be able to work closer together to really increase research being done in the field.
We've made ourselves available to other people doing research in terms of allowing access to some of the material, data and so forth that we've got. That's something that we obviously can only do with permission of the athletes. They must sign all sorts of consents in relation to that, but we've been able to do that. We look at that as an area. We look more, I think, Marie, at healthy discussions with people who are doing the same work, maybe with different rules. But the major leagues can change. They can look at research in a far quicker way than perhaps others. And so I think PCC has got a major role to play. We looked around the room, the people who were in New York, many of the laboratories in the world are keen to get grants from the PCC so that it helps them in the work that they do. There are certainly a lot of scientists who have given a lot of help to the major leagues in the room. And we can see nothing but benefit of sharing views and sharing information and then leading to whatever else we can do together. So as I said, it's an ongoing conversation, but it's one that we don't want to stop having. And we don't want to be critical of major leagues because they don't have Rule 97 or 98 like the World Anti-Doping Code. We think we're all trying to do the same sort of thing. So let's get on the same page.
I love it. I think it is so valuable to explore all of these different opportunities for collaboration. And I know Athletics Integrity Unit is continuing to grow and innovate. And you've actually recently announced that Athletics Integrity Unit will be launching a new thought leadership series called Shining a Light, which will examine different sport integrity topics. So, David, why did you decide to launch this series? And can you tell us a little bit more about it?
First of all, we think now we've got a bit of experience that we should share. Secondly, we want to be challenged and we want to challenge ourselves. So we think thought leadership is something that we can start, but we don't want to have this alone. We want others to be part of it. The way we thought we could do it was prepare a series, if you like, of op-eds where we can put out information in an op-ed and see the reactions and see what other people say. It's healthy. And perhaps lead to a situation where we convene some form of conference where we can invite people to come and share views, not to just say this is what we're doing, but to also challenge the way in which we're all doing things. Because I think it's very easy in the world of anti-doping and other issues in sport integrity to become complacent. And I don't want our team to be going to the office to have their lunch. I want them to be going to the office to think of new ways of doing things that will help those clean athletes and those athletes who are doing everything right by ensuring that they're on the start line with like people. And that's really should be our end game. So we've launched this series. One has been published already. We will continue to do these in a way that not only gives information, but also shares stuff with the public so that more the public knows about what's going on in a non-legalese fashion or non-scientific medical fashion so that they can understand the language, the better. And so along with that, Marie, of course, we share this with our member federations, and they often don't get information that says this is what's going on at the coalface. So that is a helpful way of doing this as well. So we just looked at it both from a leadership perspective, but also a very sensible communication strategy.
Oh, fantastic. And you mentioned the first of the series is already out. So where can listeners go to find it?
It's on our website. We did try to see if some of the mainstream media might publish it. I think it does feature in some of the Facebook pages that we have and certainly some of the other ways in which we get our communications out there. I can certainly know that we've got it on our website. So what we're trying to do is get better coverage of these things, both in social media, but also mainstream media.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing that resource. And we talked about how this series and a lot of your other efforts there at Athletics Integrity Unit are working to address some big challenges in anti-doping and also just in sport more generally, in sport integrity more generally. So can you talk about, David, what are some of the biggest challenges that Athletics Integrity Unit is currently facing at the moment, and how are you working to address some of these problems?
Well, I can't tell you all of them because that would take too long, Marie, but let me give you a couple of examples are probably sufficient. I mentioned Rule 15 before. One of the countries in the Category A list is Kenya, and those who follow track and field internationally will know that there have been a lot of Kenyan athletes who have been sanctioned for anti-doping misdemeanors. What we have done over the last couple of years is work very closely with the Kenyan government about the issue. They were putting, I think, $2.7 million a year into their anti-doping programs through their NADO. They agreed, following conversations with Brett and his team, to increase that by another $5 million. So what they needed to make sure that money is spent properly were experts to come and show them how to run the anti-doping program more effectively. So we have agreed to partake in that as a partner with their team. Be part of the steering group in Kenya for addressing the anti-doping program. And of course, it's not just athletics that they need to address, it's all the sports in Kenya. So we're doing something that we think is responsible. I know that WADA have been quite grateful that we're doing it. And I think that's something that just shows where you can go in terms of altering a mindset of a government. So really good work done by our team. How that will go, we have to look at on a pretty regular basis. And of course, the board will do that with some vigor. The non-doping areas, one of the areas that is fast developed over the last 6 years is the area of protection of your participants. It's sometimes called safeguarding or creating a safe sport environment. That is a big issue. And that is something that we're taking on. There are rules being drafted as we speak today, Marie, but we want those to be done at all levels, again, national levels, what we call area levels and so on, so that we will have a mandate to assist in that work. We're already doing work in what we would call the abuse and harassment area. And an example of that is the situation of the Belarusian coach who was responsible for expelling one of their sprinters at the Tokyo Olympic Games. And there are proceedings against that coach under our code of conduct going ahead at the moment. So that's an example of that area, which is one where we do need to continue to spend a lot of time and money and effort.
Absolutely. Well, David, it sounds like you have a lot of exciting work ongoing, but looking towards the future, what are some of the key focus areas for Athletics Integrity Unit maybe going forward?
One of the biggest challenges we've got, Maria, is prioritising those. So at the moment, we've got age manipulation cases. We've got situations of people falsifying qualification times. We've got cases of athletes transferring allegiance from one country to another and making up documentation. We've had people putting their names forward for election to bodies, including to the World Athletics Council at one stage, where they have, during the election campaign, broken rules relating to provision of gifts and money and so on to try to buy votes. All those matters are important. And when you add them to anti-doping and other corruption and fraud issues, you can see that the list continues to just grow. What we have to do is make sure that our money is spent well. In taking a sanction process, we're also deterring people from doing it. And so you've got to pick your cases to say, look, stop doing this stuff, anybody around the place. This is what's going to happen to you. And trusting that that will make a difference as well. So there's got to be that deterrent prevention sort of approach to what we're doing. So I think that's probably the only way I can answer the question. We've got another board meeting in a month's time, and I might find at that meeting there will be another issue that we have to list and try to prioritise. That's how quickly these things arise, and we need to deal with them quickly because otherwise they get out of control.
Absolutely. And it sounds like all of these problems are big problems. So prioritization, I can't imagine, is easy. How do you go about trying to make that short list of what you're going to tackle first or next?
Well, we get guidance from the management team, and of course, overseeing what they're doing, it requires policy. So we have pretty robust debates around our board table about whether an issue should have more priority than another issue. And after those robust debates, it's really my job to conduct the orchestra, so to speak. So I conduct the discussion around the board table, and we try to lead that into an area where we have consensus from the board. I don't think we've had any votes about these sorts of issues. And so it's through diverse backgrounds and skills of the board members that you lead to good, healthy discussions and sensible outcomes. And that's the way we do it. And so for every issue, each member of the board might have a view, and I'll make sure I go around the table and collect everybody's views and see whether we're heading in a direction where we can get that consensus. If not, we have the discussion go a bit longer, and that's the way we do it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for sharing all of your insights with us today. Is there anything else about Athletics Integrity Unit that you would like our listeners to know that we haven't covered yet?
I would like them to be able to look at the information we have about ourselves and the information relating to what we do. And if there are areas where they think we could do better, let us know. And if there are challenges that they feel we're not confronting, let us know. We're open, and we're certainly open to people having criticism and certainly open to people having good ideas that might help us do better. So there's an open invitation to your listeners.
I love it, David. We really appreciate it. Listeners, don't be shy about sharing your feedback. If our listeners want to learn more, perhaps share their ideas with you, David, what is the best way for them to do so?
Well, we've got a website, that's athleticsintegrity.org. We've got Instagram, instagram.com/AIU athletics. We've got a Twitter account, twitter.com/AIU athletics. And we've got a Facebook account, facebook.com/AIU.athletics. So each of those areas are places that you can go. Each obviously has information in a different style, but we would certainly welcome people participating in those, particularly social media discussion groups, and offering their views.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely get connected with Athletics Integrity Unit on social media and check out their website. And David, thank you again so much for joining us again on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you to your listeners for bearing with us. And I hope we have been of some help in explaining what we do.
Absolutely. It was great to have you here with us today. Listeners, wonderful to have you here as well. And if you haven't already, it would be fantastic if you could take a moment to rate our podcast, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.